Willow Creek was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and the land was as stubborn as the people who lived there. The dry, cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see, with only a few patches of green struggling to survive under the relentless sun. James had spent his whole life in this town, working the fields day in and day out. He wasn't a rich man by any means, but he took pride in what little he had: a modest house, a small patch of farmland, and a loving family. His wife, Sarah, always had a smile ready, no matter how hard the day had been, and Grace, their only daughter, was the light of their lives, with her laughter ringing out like a song, even on the hottest, most miserable days. Life wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. One particularly scorching afternoon, as James worked the field, he spotted something unusual in the distance. A boy, no older than 12 or 13, was crouched under an old, half-dead tree at the edge of their property. James paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. The boy was trying to pick something, anything, from the barren branches. His clothes tattered, his face dirty. James's heart sank. He walked over, slow and deliberate, so as not to startle the kid. When he got closer, he could see how thin the boy was, his ribs practically visible through his shirt. "You all right there, son?" James asked, his voice soft but carrying the weight of concern. The boy looked up, startled, his big brown eyes filled with a mix of fear and hunger. He didn't speak, just shook his head, clutching a handful of dried-out leaves. James sighed. "Come on now, let's get you inside, get you something to eat." For a moment, the boy hesitated, as if he didn't believe what he was hearing. But when James turned and started walking toward the house, the boy followed, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Inside, Sarah was kneading dough for bread when they came through the door. She didn't ask questions, just gave James a knowing look and set another plate at the table. She ladled out a bowl of soup for the boy, who ate like he hadn't seen food in days. James watched, his heart heavy, wondering where the boy had come from and how he had ended up in such a state. When the boy had finished, James leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel," the boy muttered between bites of bread. "And where are your folks, Daniel?" Daniel lowered his head. "Don't got none." James and Sarah exchanged a glance, and James's heart ached for the boy. No child should have to fend for themselves like that. James stood up and reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled wad of bills, $25, the only money he had saved up to buy seeds for the next planting season. He placed it on the table in front of Daniel. "Take this," James said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not much, but it'll get you on your way. You can use it to get to town, maybe find a place to stay, someone who can help you." Daniel stared at the money, his eyes wide. He didn't reach for it. "I can't take that," he whispered. James shook his head. "You can, and you will. It's what you need right now. Just promise me you'll do something good with it." The boy's lip quivered as he took the money, his hands shaking. He looked up at James, tears welling in his eyes. "I promise, sir. I'll pay you back someday. I'll come back, and I'll repay you for this." James smiled softly, patting the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about paying me back, Daniel. Just take care of yourself." Daniel stood up, clutching the money tightly in his hand. He didn't say much as he left, just a quiet "thank you" before walking out the door and disappearing down the dirt road. James watched him go, feeling a strange mix of hope and sorrow. He had done what he could, but the world was a hard place for a kid like Daniel. Still, there was something in the boy's eyes, something that told James that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right for him. That night, as James and Sarah sat by the fire, Sarah looked over at him, her expression soft. "Do you think we'll ever see that boy again?" James shrugged, staring into the flames. "Maybe. But even if we don't, I reckon we did the right thing. The world needs more kindness, Sarah. And if that boy's going to make it, he'll need all the kindness he can get." Sarah smiled, resting her head on Jim's shoulder. "You're a good man, Jim. The world could use more people like you." James didn't say anything, just held her close, the warmth of the fire washing over them as the cool night air settled in. The land might be tough, the times might be harder, but tonight, for just a moment, they had hope. The days in Willow Creek passed as they always had, slow and steady, marked by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Life for James and his family went on, with the memory of Daniel slowly fading into the background. Yet, the boy's quiet "thank you" and his promise to return someday lingered in James's mind. He didn't expect much from it. Life had taught him not to. But there was something about the sincerity in Daniel's voice that stuck with him. Weeks turned into months, and the months into years. James continued his daily routine, working the fields from dawn till dusk, always trying to make the most out of what little the land provided. The money he had given Daniel, though missed, didn't feel like a loss. It was as if he had planted something deeper, a seed of hope that one day might bear fruit. Not that James ever expected to see Daniel again. He didn't even know where the boy had gone. But deep down, he held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was out there somewhere, making something of himself. Sarah, as usual, kept the house running. She never complained, though James knew things were hard for her. The work never stopped, and with their daughter, Grace, growing older, there were new concerns to think about. School fees, supplies, and the ever-present worry of whether they could make it through the next season. But like James, Sarah didn't speak much of these troubles. They were a part of life, and they faced them with the quiet strength that defined so many in Willow Creek. Grace, though, was the bright spot in their lives. Even on the most difficult days, her laughter filled the small house, bringing warmth and light. She had inherited her mother's smile and her father's quiet determination. From a young age, she had taken to helping on the farm, doing what she could to lighten the load. But as she grew older, it became clear that Grace had bigger dreams than the farm could hold. "I want to be a teacher," she had told James one evening, her eyes shining with excitement. "I want to help kids, just like you helped Daniel." James had smiled at that, his heart swelling with pride. He knew they didn't have the money to send Grace to college, but the way she talked about it, he couldn't bring himself to dampen her spirit. Instead, he encouraged her dreams, telling her to work hard and stay focused. Maybe, he thought, things would fall into place somehow. It wasn't long after Grace's declaration that her health started to decline. At first, it was just little things. Fatigue, the occasional cough. But it didn't take long for the symptoms to worsen. The doctors in town couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong, but they all agreed on one thing. Grace needed treatment, and it wasn't going to be cheap. James and Sarah were devastated. Their world, already fragile, seemed to be crumbling around them. The little savings they had wouldn't be enough to cover the costs, and without the money, Grace's future, their future, looked bleak. James, for the first time in years, found himself feeling truly powerless. One evening, as they sat around the table, the weight of the situation bearing down on them, Grace looked up at her father. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." James smiled at her, but the sadness in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. "I'm not so sure this time, Grace. But we'll keep trying." The truth was, James didn't know what to do. He had always been able to provide for his family, even if it meant going without himself. But this was beyond him. He had no idea where to turn or how to make things right. One day, as James was working in the field, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. He paused, squinting against the sun as the shape of a large vehicle came into view. It was unusual for anyone to drive out this way. Most of the folks in Willow Creek didn't even have cars that fancy. As the vehicle grew closer, James could see it was a sleek black SUV, the kind of car that only someone with money would own. His heart began to race as the car slowed to a stop in front of the house. A man stepped out, dressed sharply in a suit, his shoes glinting in the sunlight. James stood still, unsure of what to think. As the man approached, something about him seemed familiar, the way he moved, the look in his eyes. "Mr. James?" the man called out, his voice clear and confident. James furrowed his brow. "That's me." The man smiled, and in that moment James saw it, the boy he had helped all those years ago. It was Daniel, now a grown man, standing before him, dressed in the finest clothes James had ever seen. "Daniel?" James asked, barely believing his eyes. Daniel nodded, his smile widening. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" James was speechless. He had always wondered what had happened to the boy, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this. Daniel, no longer the skinny, hungry kid who had wandered onto his farm, was now standing before him as a man of wealth and success. Daniel stepped forward, extending his hand. "I made a promise to you all those years ago, and I intend to keep it." James shook his hand, still in shock. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes softened, and with a sincerity that brought back memories of their first encounter, he said, "You saved my life that day, Mr. James. Now, it's my turn to help you." James stood there, his mind racing as he took in the sight of Daniel, no longer the frail, starving boy he had once helped, but now a confident, successful man. Time had done more than just change their lives. It had transformed them completely. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with memories of a kind gesture, of a promise made under the scorching sun, and of years spent wondering what had happened to the boy who disappeared down the dirt road. "I can't believe it's really you," James finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "I never forgot what you did for me, Mr. James. Not for 1 second. I owe you everything." James waved his hand dismissively, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, son. I did what anyone would have done." Daniel's expression turned serious, his eyes locking onto James's. "No, not everyone would have done that. You and your family saved me when I had nothing. I was just a scared kid with no one to turn to, and you gave me a chance. I've never forgotten that." James's thoughts drifted back to that day, how Daniel had seemed so lost, so helpless. It had been an act of pure instinct to help him, something he didn't think twice about. But now, standing in front of this man who had turned his life around, James began to realize just how significant that moment had been. "Let's sit," Daniel said, gesturing toward the front porch. "I want to tell you everything." They made their way to the old wooden chairs on the porch, the same ones that had been there for years. Daniel glanced around, taking in the surroundings with a nostalgic smile. The house hadn't changed much, except for the wear and tear that time had inflicted on it. James sat down heavily, his mind still struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. "You look good," James said, his voice a mix of pride and surprise. "Seems like life's treated you well." Daniel nodded, leaning back in the chair. "I've been blessed, Mr. James. More than I could have ever imagined." He paused, looking out at the fields. "Those $25 you gave me, they were everything. I used that money to buy a bus ticket to the city. I didn't have much of a plan, but I knew I had to get out of here if I was ever going to make something of myself." James listened intently as Daniel recounted the story of his life after leaving Willow Creek. He had arrived in the city with nothing but the clothes on his back and the determination to make a better life. At first, things had been tough, sleeping in shelters, doing odd jobs just to get by. But slowly, Daniel had worked his way up. He had found mentors along the way, people who believed in him and helped him get an education. Eventually, he had built a successful business from the ground up. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the start I needed. I've spent the last 25 years working, trying to make something of myself, and every day I thought about you and your family." James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always wondered what had become of Daniel, but he had never expected something like this. "We're proud of you, Dan," James said softly. "You've done well." Daniel smiled, but there was a sadness behind his eyes. "I know things haven't been easy for you either, Mr. James. That's why I'm here. I want to repay the kindness you showed me." James opened his mouth to protest, but Daniel held up his hand. "I know you're proud, and I respect that. But this isn't charity. This is me keeping my promise. I want to help." Before James could respond, the front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Daniel. "Is that—" Sarah began, her voice trailing off. "Sarah," James said, standing up and gesturing toward their visitor. "You remember Daniel, don't you?" Sarah's face lit up with recognition, and she hurried over, pulling Daniel into a tight embrace. "Oh my goodness, look at you, all grown up and successful." She stepped back, taking a good look at him. "We've wondered about you for so long." Daniel grinned, clearly touched by the warm reception. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Sarah. I've thought about you and Mr. James every day." They all sat down, and Daniel continued to tell his story. James and Sarah listened, captivated by the journey this young boy had taken and the man he had become. The struggles, the hard work, and the triumphs. It was a story of resilience, but also of gratitude. And through it all, Daniel made one thing clear. He had never forgotten the kindness shown to him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the conversation turned to the present. Daniel's gaze shifted to James, his expression turning serious once more. "I know times have been tough for you," Daniel said, his voice gentle. "I heard about Grace, about her illness." James's heart clenched. Grace was always at the forefront of his mind, her declining health casting a shadow over every aspect of their lives. "She's not well," he admitted quietly. "We've been trying to get her the help she needs, but we don't have the money." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's why I'm here. I want to help. Whatever it takes to get her the treatment she needs, I'll cover it. Doctors, hospitals, whatever. I'll make sure she gets the best care." James stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. It was too much. He had never expected this, never thought that the boy he had helped so long ago would come back and offer something so incredible. "I can't let you do that," James said, shaking his head. "It's too much." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. "Mr. James, you saved my life. Now, let me help save hers." The quiet evening air settled around the house as Daniel's words lingered in James's mind. The offer to help Grace, to provide the care she so desperately needed, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But there was still that nagging voice in James's head, the one that told him he couldn't accept so much from anyone, not even from someone like Daniel. He had spent his whole life working, providing for his family, and relying on others had never been part of the plan. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Daniel, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected." Daniel smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I didn't come back to expect anything from you, Mr. James. I came back because you gave me a chance when I had nothing. You helped me when no one else would. Now, it's my turn to do the same." James shifted uncomfortably, his pride and gratitude battling inside him. He glanced at Sarah, who sat quietly beside him, her hands resting in her lap. She was watching him closely, her expression soft but knowing. She'd always been the more pragmatic of the two, and she could see the opportunity that Daniel's return represented. Sarah reached over and placed her hand gently on Jim's arm. "Jim," she said softly, "maybe this is what we need. Maybe it's okay to let someone else help, just this once." James looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to swallow. Accepting help wasn't something he was used to. But then he thought of Grace, of her pale face, her tired eyes, the way she tried so hard to stay strong for them. If he didn't do something soon, it might be too late. Daniel seemed to sense the struggle going on in James's mind. "I know it's not easy to accept help," he said, his voice low and understanding. "But this isn't just about you or me. It's about Grace. She deserves a chance, and if I can give her that, then I want to. Please, Mr. James, let me do this." James closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. When he opened them, he met Daniel's gaze, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. "All right," James said quietly. "If it means Grace gets the help she needs, then yes. We'll accept your offer." A wave of relief washed over Daniel's face, and he nodded, clearly pleased with James's decision. "Thank you, Mr. James. I promise you, we'll get her the best care. I've already spoken to some doctors in the city, top specialists. They'll take good care of her." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and she squeezed Jim's arm reassuringly. "We're grateful, Daniel," she said softly. "More than you know." Daniel smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what I've always wanted to do, paying back the kindness you showed me." As the conversation shifted to the details of Grace's treatment, James couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, real hope, that Grace might have a chance. The burden that had weighed so heavily on his shoulders for months seemed to lighten just a little, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He stared out the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the field. The quiet moments of the morning had always been his favorite, the world still and calm before the day's work began. But today felt different. There was a nervous energy buzzing inside him, a mix of anticipation and worry. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her footsteps light as she approached him. "You're up early," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Couldn't sleep," James admitted. "Got a lot on my mind." Sarah nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting beside him. "It's going to be all right, you know. Daniel's going to help. We're not alone in this anymore." James took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. "I know. It's just, I still can't believe it. After all these years, he came back. And not just to say thank you. He's really going to help Grace. It's more than I ever expected." Sarah smiled softly. "Sometimes life surprises you. You did a good thing all those years ago, Jim. And now it's coming back to us, in ways we never imagined." James nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. He had never done what he did for recognition or repayment. He had helped Daniel because it was the right thing to do. And now, all these years later, that kindness was being returned tenfold. Later that day, Daniel returned with a plan in place. He had already arranged for a specialist to see Grace at a hospital in the city. All the arrangements were made: transportation, medical bills, everything. James and Sarah were amazed at how quickly things had moved, and they couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by Daniel's generosity. "I'll take care of everything," Daniel assured them. "You just focus on getting Grace ready. We'll leave tomorrow." James and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with a mix of hope and anxiety. The thought of leaving Willow Creek, even for a short time, was daunting. But it was for Grace's sake. They had to be strong for her. As the day drew to a close, Grace, unaware of the full extent of Daniel's plans, sat by the window, gazing out at the fields. Her illness had taken so much from her, her energy, her spirit, but there was still a quiet strength in her that James admired. She had always been resilient, and he prayed that she would have the strength to fight this battle. James walked over to her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get you some help, Grace. The best doctors there are. Daniel's making sure of it." Grace looked up at him, her eyes tired but grateful. "I don't know what to say, Dad." "You don't have to say anything," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Just focus on getting better." The following morning was filled with a quiet but determined sense of urgency. Daniel had arranged for a car to take James, Sarah, and Grace to the city for Grace's treatment, and as the sun rose over the fields of Willow Creek, they all knew that this day marked the beginning of something new. James and Sarah packed a small bag for the trip, careful to bring only what was necessary. Grace, though weak, moved around the house slowly, trying to help where she could. "You don't need to worry about anything," Sarah said gently, guiding Grace back to her chair. "We'll take care of it all. You just need to rest." Grace smiled, though it was a tired one. She was grateful for the help, but she hated feeling like a burden. She had always been strong, independent, and now this illness had taken so much from her: her energy, her freedom, and in some ways, her hope. But there was a light at the end of this dark tunnel, and that light was Daniel. His return, and the offer to help, had given her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel arrived just as they were finishing up, his usual confident and calm demeanor putting them all at ease. He carried with him an air of reassurance that everything was going to be all right. He greeted James and Sarah with a warm smile and turned to Grace with a look of genuine concern. "Ready for this?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but encouraging. Grace nodded, her gaze meeting his. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the city was quiet, with the hum of the car's engine filling the silence. James sat in the front passenger seat, staring out at the passing fields, his mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. He still couldn't quite believe this was all happening. Just days ago, he had been preparing himself for the worst, thinking there was no way out of the dire situation Grace was in. And now, thanks to Daniel, there was a real chance she might get better. Sarah sat in the back with Grace, her hand resting on her daughter's knee in a silent gesture of comfort. She was hopeful, but like James, there was a small part of her that feared disappointment. They had been through so much, and she didn't want to let herself believe in something only to have it taken away. But as she looked at Daniel, sitting confidently behind the wheel, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to turn in their favor. The city loomed ahead of them, tall buildings and busy streets, a stark contrast to the quiet rural life they had always known. For Grace, the sight was overwhelming. She hadn't been outside of Willow Creek in years, and the energy of the city was both exhilarating and intimidating. But Daniel seemed completely at ease, navigating the traffic with a practiced hand. "We're almost there," Daniel said, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "The hospital is just up ahead. I spoke with the doctors again this morning. They're ready for us." Grace felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This was it. She was about to walk into a world she didn't understand, a world of tests and treatments, doctors and specialists. It was a lot to take in, but she had to be strong. She had to believe that this was the beginning of her recovery. When they arrived at the hospital, Daniel parked the car and helped Grace out, his hand steady as he guided her through the entrance. The hospital was enormous, filled with people bustling about, and the sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Grace's legs felt shaky beneath her, but Daniel was right there by her side, his presence calming her nerves. They were greeted by a team of doctors and nurses, all of whom seemed to know Daniel well. He had made sure that everything was in place, and the efficiency with which they were brought in and settled was remarkable. Grace was taken for some initial tests, and while she was gone, James and Sarah sat in the waiting room with Daniel. "This is more than we could have ever hoped for," Sarah said quietly, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know how we'll ever thank you, Daniel." Daniel shook his head. "There's nothing to thank me for. This is the least I could do. You helped me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." James, who had been quiet for most of the day, finally spoke. "It's just hard to believe," he admitted. "We've been through so much. For the longest time, I thought there wasn't any hope left for Grace." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's always hope, Mr. James. That's something you taught me a long time ago. You gave me hope when I didn't have any. And now, it's my turn to pass that on." James met Daniel's gaze, and in that moment, he understood. It wasn't just about the money or the treatment. It was about something deeper. Daniel wasn't here out of obligation. He was here because he genuinely cared, because the kindness that James had shown him all those years ago had created a bond between them that went beyond mere gratitude. Hours passed as Grace underwent her tests, and the waiting seemed endless. James and Sarah sat in tense silence, their hands tightly clasped together. Daniel, too, was quiet, though his calm exterior never wavered. It was clear that he was just as invested in Grace's recovery as they were. Finally, a doctor emerged from the back, his expression neutral as he approached them. James stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "How is she, Doc?" The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "She's stable. We've completed the initial tests, and while we'll need to run a few more, I'm optimistic. We're going to start treatment right away." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, and James felt the tension in his body ease ever so slightly. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The doctor nodded. "We're going to do everything we can for her. She's in good hands." As they settled back into the waiting room, Daniel turned to James and Sarah. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "But we're in this together. Whatever happens, I'll be here." James looked at Daniel, his heart full of gratitude. It was hard to put into words how much this meant to him, to know that they weren't alone in this fight. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real. The days that followed were a whirlwind of doctors, tests, and treatments. Grace remained in the hospital, her body slowly responding to the care she was receiving. Each day, James, Sarah, and Daniel would visit her, sitting by her bedside, offering comfort and encouragement. It was a long road, but the glimmers of improvement were there, small signs that Grace was beginning to regain some of her strength. Grace, though exhausted, found herself feeling more hopeful than she had in months. The kindness and support from her family, and especially from Daniel, gave her the courage to keep fighting. She would often catch Daniel watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration, and though she hadn't quite figured out what to make of it, she appreciated his constant presence. "I'm feeling a little better today," Grace would say on the days when her energy allowed her to speak more than a few words at a time. "That's good," James would reply, his face lighting up at the sound of her voice. "You just keep resting, sweetheart. We're all here with you." Sarah would nod in agreement, squeezing Grace's hand, while Daniel sat quietly, his expression unreadable but always supportive. He didn't have to say much. His actions spoke louder than words. As the days turned into weeks, Grace's condition continued to improve, though it was a slow and steady process. She began to regain some color in her cheeks, and her strength started to return, little by little. The doctors were optimistic, but they made it clear that the road to full recovery would be long and uncertain. During this time, Daniel became more than just a benefactor. He was there for every step of Grace's journey, sitting with her through the long hours of treatment, holding her hand when the pain became too much, and offering words of encouragement when she felt like giving up. One afternoon, as Grace rested in her hospital bed, Daniel sat by her side, flipping through a book he had brought her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines that monitored Grace's vitals. Grace, her eyes half closed, turned her head slightly to look at Daniel. "You don't have to stay here all the time, you know," she said softly, her voice still weak but gaining strength. Daniel glanced up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to be here," he said simply. "You don't have to go through this alone." Grace smiled faintly, touched by his sincerity. She had never known someone like Daniel, someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being without expecting anything in return. It was a strange feeling, but a comforting one. "You've done so much for me already," she said after a moment. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Grace. I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing it because I want to. You're important to me." Grace's smile faded slightly as she processed his words. There was something in the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that made her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure if it was the medicine or her own emotions, but there was a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied, his gaze steady and calm. "Just focus on getting better. That's all I want." Grace closed her eyes, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But before she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but think about Daniel, about his kindness, his unwavering support, and the way he made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. As Grace's condition continued to improve, so did the bond between her and Daniel. What had started as a simple act of gratitude on Daniel's part was slowly turning into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Daniel found himself drawn to Grace in ways that went beyond his initial desire to repay the kindness her family had shown him. There was a connection between them, one that grew stronger with each passing day. For James and Sarah, it was a relief to see Grace recovering. Her health had been their biggest worry for so long, and now, with the help of Daniel and the doctors, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. But as they watched Grace and Daniel together, they couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in their dynamic. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, James and Sarah sat in the hospital's small cafeteria, sipping on lukewarm coffee. The day had been a good one. Grace was showing signs of real improvement, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could breathe a little easier. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" Sarah asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. James glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Noticed what?" "Daniel and Grace," Sarah said, her tone light but knowing. "There's something going on between them." James frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You think so?" Sarah smiled softly. "I've seen the way he looks at her, Jim. He cares about her. And I think she's starting to feel the same." James let out a long breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know, Sarah. Daniel's been nothing but good to us. But this is Grace. I just don't want her to get hurt." Sarah reached across the table, placed her hand on his. "I don't think he would hurt her, Jim. Daniel's a good man. He's been there for her every step of the way. Maybe this is something good, something we didn't see coming." James nodded slowly, though the protective father in him wasn't so easily convinced. He trusted Daniel. He had no reason not to. But the thought of his daughter becoming attached to someone who had come into their lives under such unusual circumstances made him uneasy. Still, he couldn't deny that Daniel had done more for their family than they could have ever hoped for. "I suppose we'll just have to see how it plays out," James said, his voice resigned but not without hope. Over the next few weeks, Grace's recovery continued. The treatments were working, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. Each day, she grew a little stronger, her spirit lifting as her health improved. And with that improvement came the slow, undeniable realization that her feelings for Daniel were changing. What had once been gratitude was evolving into something more. She couldn't deny the growing connection between them, the way her heart seemed to skip a beat whenever he walked into the room. And as much as she tried to push those feelings aside, she found it harder and harder to ignore. One evening, as Daniel sat by her bedside, reading aloud from a book, Grace found herself watching him, really watching him. His focus on the words, the way his voice softened with each turn of the page, the way he seemed to be completely at ease in her presence. There was something about him that made her feel safe, cared for, in a way she hadn't expected. And in that moment, Grace knew. As the days turned into weeks, Grace found herself grappling with feelings she had never anticipated. Her recovery was slow but steady, and every day brought a small victory, a little more strength in her legs, a little less pain in her chest. But with each step forward in her physical health, she also found herself moving closer to an emotional realization that left her both excited and uncertain. She had come to depend on Daniel, not just for the financial and emotional support he had provided, but for something deeper, something that had taken root in her heart without her even noticing. It was as if the kindness he had shown her had become a bridge to something more, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope, and even the beginnings of love. Daniel had been with her through it all, through the darkest days of her illness, through the sleepless nights when pain and fear had kept her awake, and through the small, quiet moments when all she needed was someone to sit with her in silence. He had been her rock, and now, as she began to regain her strength, Grace couldn't deny that her feelings for him had evolved into something more than just gratitude. One afternoon, as Grace sat by the window in her hospital room, watching the sunlight filter through the trees outside, Daniel arrived with his usual warm smile. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, which he placed on the table next to her bed. "You didn't have to bring those," Grace said, though her heart warmed at the gesture. "I wanted to," Daniel replied, his smile soft but genuine. "How are you feeling today?" Grace looked up at him, the sunlight catching her eyes. "Better," she said honestly. "I feel stronger every day. Thanks to you." Daniel shook his head. "You're the one doing all the hard work. I'm just here to cheer you on." Grace smiled, her heart skipping a beat at the sincerity in his voice. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way his gaze seemed to linger just a little longer than necessary, that made her wonder if he felt it too. This connection, this bond that had formed between them. She wasn't sure when it had started, but she knew it was there, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. As the afternoon sunlight faded and the room grew dimmer, Grace found herself growing more contemplative. Daniel sat by her bedside, reading aloud from the book they had started together. His voice was soothing, and she closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. But instead of listening to the story, her mind wandered to him, the way he had been there for her, how his presence had become such a comfort. "Daniel," Grace said softly, interrupting his reading. He looked up from the book, a question in his eyes. "What is it?" Grace hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to say what was on her mind. But she couldn't hold back any longer. She needed to know if he felt the same, if this connection was real. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything. About you." Daniel closed the book, placing it gently on the table beside him. His full attention was on her now, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've done so much for me, more than I could ever ask for," Grace continued, her heart pounding in her chest. "And I've been trying to figure out how to thank you, how to repay you. But the truth is, I don't think it's just gratitude I'm feeling anymore." Daniel's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, as if to encourage her to keep going. I think I'm starting to feel something more," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I didn't expect. I don't know what it means, or if I'm even ready to feel it, but it's there. And I don't know if you feel it too." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Grace felt her heart race as she waited for Daniel to respond, unsure of what he would say or if she had just made a terrible mistake. Daniel's gaze softened, and he reached out to take her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Grace," he began, his voice low and steady, "you have no idea how much you mean to me." Grace's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. "I've been trying to keep my feelings in check," Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "because the last thing I wanted was to make things harder for you. But the truth is, I've felt it too. For a while now. I just didn't know how to say it, or if it was the right time." Grace's heart swelled with emotion, a mix of relief and joy washing over her. She hadn't been imagining it. The connection between them was real, and Daniel felt it just as strongly as she did. "I care about you, Grace," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "More than I ever thought possible. And I don't want to rush anything, but I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, I'm right there with you." Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that flooded through her. She had been so afraid to admit her feelings, so unsure of what would happen if she did. But now, hearing Daniel say those words, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. "I don't know what comes next," Grace said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I do know that I want you to be a part of it." Daniel smiled, his hand squeezing hers gently. "We'll figure it out together." They sat there in the fading light, their hands clasped together, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just about the kindness or the gratitude anymore. It was something deeper, something that had taken root and blossomed into something beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that was filled with more than just recovery. It was a future that included Daniel, and the thought of that filled her heart with a sense of hope and happiness she hadn't felt in years. Grace had never been the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, but ever since her quiet confession to Daniel, she felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. The weight of uncertainty, of not knowing where they stood, had been lifted. There was a clarity between them now, a shared understanding that had taken root during those long, quiet days in the hospital. But even with that weight lifted, there was still so much left unsaid. The next few days passed in a blur of treatments and small improvements. Grace was getting stronger, strong enough that the doctors began talking about her eventual release from the hospital. It was good news, and yet it brought with it a new set of worries. What would happen after she went home? How would things change between her and Daniel now that their feelings were out in the open? One afternoon, as they sat in her hospital room, the conversation finally turned to the inevitable. "So," Grace said, her voice light but filled with underlying tension, "the doctors think I might be able to go home soon." Daniel looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression brightening. "That's great news." Grace nodded, her hands fiddling with the blanket that covered her legs. "It is. I'm excited, of course, but I guess I'm also a little nervous." Daniel frowned slightly, closing the book and setting it aside. "Nervous about what?" Grace hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "About what happens next. I mean, we've been here, in this bubble, for weeks now. Everything's been about my treatment, about getting better. But once I go home, things are going to change, aren't they?" Daniel's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at her. "Things don't have to change, Grace. Not between us." Grace let out a small laugh, though there was little humor in it. "I know, but it's easy to say that now, when we're still here. What if things get complicated?" Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his. "Things are already complicated," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean we can't figure it out. I'm not going anywhere, Grace. No matter what happens." Grace met his gaze, her heart swelling at his words. She wanted to believe him, and deep down she knew he meant it. But there was still that small, nagging doubt in the back of her mind, the fear that once they left the safety of the hospital, everything would feel different. "I just don't want to lose what we have," she whispered. "You won't," Daniel assured her. "We'll take it one day at a time. You're not in this alone, Grace. I'm here for whatever comes next." Grace smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. Daniel's presence, his unwavering support, had been a constant throughout her recovery, and now, knowing that he was committed to staying by her side, she felt a weight lift from her chest. A few days later, Grace was finally discharged from the hospital. It was a bittersweet moment. She was grateful to be going home, but there was a part of her that would miss the routine of the hospital, the safety net that had been there during her most vulnerable days. But she wasn't going home alone. Daniel had insisted on driving her, making sure she was comfortable and cared for every step of the way. As they drove down the long, winding road that led out of the city and back toward Willow Creek, Grace found herself staring out the window, watching the landscape shift from tall buildings and crowded streets to open fields and wide, empty skies. It was strange, being back in the world after so many weeks confined to a hospital bed. The air felt fresher, the sun warmer, but there was also a sense of uncertainty that hung over her. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, glancing over at her as he drove. Grace turned to look at him, her lips curving into a small smile. "I don't know. Just everything, I guess. It's strange to be out here again, to be going home." Daniel nodded, understanding. "It's a big change, after everything you've been through. But you're stronger now. You've come a long way." Grace smiled, appreciating his words, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what came next, not just for her, but for them. When they arrived at the farm, James and Sarah were waiting on the porch, their faces lighting up with joy at the sight of Grace. They rushed down the steps to greet her, pulling her into a warm embrace. Jim's eyes were misty as he hugged his daughter, and Sarah's smile was wider than Grace had seen in months. "You're home," Sarah said softly, brushing a strand of Grace's hair behind her ear. "You're finally home." Grace nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It felt good to be home, to be surrounded by the familiar sights and smells of the farm. But as she glanced over at Daniel, who was standing a few feet away, watching the reunion with a small smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved between them. That evening, after James and Sarah had gone to bed, Grace found herself sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark fields. The air was cool, and the stars twinkled above her, casting a soft glow over the landscape. She heard the creak of the porch door behind her and turned to see Daniel stepping outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Grace shook her head, gesturing to the empty space beside her. "Not at all." Daniel sat down next to her, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the stars. Grace could feel the tension building inside her, the unspoken words she had been carrying since they left the hospital bubbling up to the surface. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet in the stillness of the night, "about us." Daniel turned to look at her, his expression calm but attentive. "What about us?" Grace took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I meant what I said before, in the hospital, about how I feel. But now that I'm home, I just want to be sure we're on the same page." Daniel reached over, taking her hand in his. "Grace, I've been sure about this for a long time. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. And I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to pretend like what we have isn't real." Grace's heart swelled at his words, a sense of relief washing over her. She had been so afraid of what might happen when they left the hospital, but now, sitting here under the stars with Daniel, she realized that her fears had been unfounded. "I don't want to pretend either," she whispered. Daniel smiled, his hand squeezing hers gently. "Then we don't have to. We'll take things as they come. Together." And in that moment, under the vast night sky, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The days that followed Grace's return to the farm were filled with a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in months. The weight of her illness had begun to lift, and each morning she woke up feeling just a little bit stronger. Her body was healing, slowly but surely, and with that healing came a newfound clarity about what she wanted for her future, both for herself and for her relationship with Daniel. Daniel had stayed in Willow Creek, renting a small place nearby so he could continue to be close to her and her family. He didn't want to push her, and their time together had become a delicate balance between giving her space to recover and being there for her whenever she needed him. They spent their days walking around the farm, talking about life, their hopes, and even their fears. It felt like they were building something real, something that extended beyond the boundaries of gratitude or obligation. Grace, though still cautious, felt her heart opening more each day. There was a part of her that had been holding back, afraid that the connection they had built in the hospital wouldn't translate to real life. But as the days turned into weeks, those fears began to fade. Daniel had shown her, time and again, that he was here for the long haul. One evening, as they sat together under the stars once again, Grace found herself reflecting on how far she had come. It was strange to think that just a few months ago she had been lying in a hospital bed, unsure if she would even survive. And now, here she was, not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. "I've been thinking," Grace said, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. Daniel turned to look at her, his expression curious but patient. "About what?" "About everything," Grace replied, her eyes drifting toward the dark fields that stretched out before them. "About the farm, about my parents, about us." Daniel's gaze softened, and he shifted slightly in his seat, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Grace took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I think, for a long time, I was afraid to imagine a future for myself. The illness took so much from me, and there were days when I didn't think I'd ever get better. But now I can finally start thinking about the future again, and I want you to be a part of it." Daniel's expression remained calm, but Grace could see the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I want that too, Grace," he said quietly. "I've wanted that for a while now." Grace smiled, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. "It's just, everything feels so different now. I feel different. Stronger, more hopeful. And I think a part of that is because of you." Daniel's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers gently. "You've always been strong, Grace. You didn't need me to show you that. But I'm glad if I've been able to help." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that whatever it is, I want us to face it together." Daniel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "We will," he promised, "one step at a time." Over the next few weeks, as Grace continued to regain her strength, she and Daniel became inseparable. They spent nearly every day together, their bond deepening with each shared moment, every laugh, and every quiet conversation. James and Sarah had taken notice, and while James remained cautiously optimistic about the blossoming relationship between his daughter and Daniel, Sarah couldn't hide her delight. "You know, I think they're good for each other," Sarah said one evening as she and James sat together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. James, his arms crossed over his chest, glanced over at her. "You think so?" Sarah nodded, her smile soft. "I do. Grace has been through so much, and for a while there, I didn't think we'd ever see her smile again. But now, look at her. She's happy. And I think Daniel has a lot to do with that." James was silent for a moment, watching as Daniel and Grace walked hand in hand across the field, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. He couldn't deny that his daughter seemed happier, healthier than she had in months. And Daniel, well, James had to admit that the young man had proven himself time and again. He had been there for Grace in ways James couldn't, and for that he was grateful. "I suppose you're right," James said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "He's been good to her." Sarah smiled, patting his knee affectionately. "You'll see, Jim. This is a good thing for Grace." The days were filled with a newfound sense of purpose. She began helping out around the farm again, taking on small tasks that made her feel like she was contributing once more. Her body was still recovering, and there were days when fatigue crept up on her, but she didn't let it stop her. Each step forward felt like a victory, and she clung to that sense of progress with both hands. One afternoon, as she and Daniel were walking through the fields, Grace suddenly stopped, turning to face him. "Daniel," she began, her tone serious, "there's something I need to say." Daniel stopped, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Grace took a deep breath, her heart racing. "I don't know if I've said this enough, but I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me. You saved my life, in more ways than one. And I don't just mean the hospital, or the doctors, or the treatments. You've been there for me, every step of the way, and I—" Daniel gently placed his hand on her cheek, cutting her off with a tender look. "Grace, you don't have to thank me. I did what I did because I care about you, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Grace felt like the world had stopped. She stared up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to truly feel what had been building inside her all this time. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel's smile was soft, but there was a depth to his eyes that made Grace's heart swell. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and in that moment, under the vast open sky of Willow Creek, Grace knew that she had found something she hadn't even realized she was searching for, a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of something more. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, the world around them fading into the background. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt like everything was going to be okay. The bond between Grace and Daniel had grown stronger with each passing day, and now, with their feelings for each other fully out in the open, it felt like the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Life in Willow Creek had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Grace was recovering well, the farm was running smoothly, and the sense of hope and happiness that had once seemed so distant was now a constant presence in their lives. But there was one last bridge to cross. While Grace had accepted her feelings for Daniel, and Daniel had made it clear that he was committed to her and her family, James had yet to fully come to terms with the idea. He trusted Daniel, but the thought of his daughter being in a relationship with someone who had come into their lives under such unusual circumstances still made him cautious. One evening, after a long day of working on the farm, James sat on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The familiar scent of earth and grass filled the air, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. It was a scene James had seen countless times before, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Grace, about how much she had been through, and how much she had changed since Daniel had come back into their lives. Sarah joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee as she sat down beside him. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, her voice gentle. James took a sip of the coffee, nodding slightly. "Just thinking." "About Grace and Daniel?" Sarah asked, her tone knowing. James let out a long sigh. "Yeah. I can't help it, Sarah. I know Daniel's been good to us, better than we could have ever asked for. But it's still hard for me. I just want to make sure she's going to be all right." Sarah smiled softly, placing her hand on his arm. "I understand. You're her father, and you'll always worry about her. But you've seen how happy she is. Daniel's been there for her every step of the way, and he's proven that he cares about her. I think it's time we trust that." James stared out at the fields, his expression thoughtful. "I do trust him," he admitted. "It's just, this whole thing still feels so unreal. All these years we struggled, and then Daniel came back out of nowhere. It's like a dream, and I'm still waiting to wake up." Sarah chuckled softly. "Sometimes life surprises us, Jim. You taught me that. And maybe this is just one of those times when everything falls into place." James was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. He knew she was right. Grace was happier than she had been in years, and Daniel had shown time and again that his intentions were pure. But as a father, it was hard to let go of that protective instinct, the one that told him to be cautious, to guard his daughter's heart. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, James found himself watching Daniel and Grace interact. There was an ease between them that was impossible to ignore. The way they spoke to each other, the small, affectionate gestures they shared. It was clear that Daniel's feelings for Grace went beyond simple gratitude, and it was equally clear that Grace felt the same. After dinner, as the plates were cleared and the evening began to wind down, James asked Daniel to step outside with him. The two men stood on the porch, the cool night air surrounding them, the sounds of the farm settling into its nighttime quiet. "Daniel," James began, his voice calm but serious, "there's something I need to say." Daniel turned to face him, his expression attentive. Of course, Mr. James. What's on your mind? James hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. I've watched you and Grace grow close over these past few months, and I can see how much you care about her. She means the world to me, and I just want to make sure that whatever this is between you two, that you're in it for the right reasons. Daniel met James's gaze, his expression steady. Mr. James, I understand your concerns, and I want you to know that my feelings for Grace aren't something I take lightly. I love her. I've loved her for a while now, and I want to build a future with her. This isn't about paying back a debt or anything like that. It's real. James nodded slowly, taking in Daniel's words. There was something about the way Daniel spoke, earnest and sincere, that eased the lingering doubts in his mind. It was clear that this young man, the same boy he had once helped all those years ago, had grown into someone who was not only capable of caring for his daughter, but who truly wanted to be a part of their family. I believe you, James said finally, his voice soft but firm, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. You've given Grace a second chance at life, and for that, I'll always be thankful. But more than that, you've become part of our family. Daniel's eyes softened, and he nodded, clearly moved by James's words. Thank you, Mr. James. That means more to me than you know. James reached out and clasped Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm. Just take care of her. That's all I ask. I will, Daniel promised, his voice steady. You have my word. With that, a sense of peace settled over James. He had spent so much time worrying about the future, about what would happen to Grace. But now, standing there with Daniel, he realized that things had changed. Grace wasn't just his little girl anymore. She was a woman who had been through more than most, and she had found someone who truly cared for her. As they rejoined the family, the air between them lighter, James caught Grace's eye. She smiled at him, a knowing look in her gaze, and James felt his heart swell with pride. She was going to be all right. They all were. That night, as James lay in bed beside Sarah, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. The farm was quiet, the night air cool against the open window, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to relax. His family was whole again, and for that he was deeply, profoundly grateful. The following weeks felt like a dream, one where every moment was filled with warmth, love, and the quiet contentment of lives falling into place. The farm bustled with life again as Grace continued to regain her strength, and with Daniel by her side, the once daunting challenges of the future now seemed manageable. Grace had taken on more responsibilities around the farm, and the work, which had once been a burden, now felt like a joy. Every morning, she would wake up with a sense of purpose, knowing that each day brought her closer to full recovery. Her health was steadily improving, and the doctors had assured her that with time and care, she would continue to get stronger. But it wasn't just her physical health that had changed. Her heart had too. The bond she shared with Daniel had deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. What had started as a simple act of gratitude had blossomed into something far more profound. It was love, real and undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt like her future was filled with possibilities. One afternoon, as Grace and Daniel worked together in the fields, planting seeds for the upcoming season, Grace paused to take in the sight around her. The fields stretched out in front of them, the sun shining down on the fresh earth. It was a scene of renewal, of life beginning again after a long winter. And as she looked over at Daniel, who was focused on his work, she felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. "This feels good," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Daniel looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "It does," he agreed, his smile easy. "It's like everything's finally coming together." Grace nodded, her heart full. "I never thought I'd be here again, doing this," she admitted. "There were times when I thought I'd never see these fields again. But now, it feels like home." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "This is home," he said softly, "and you're exactly where you're meant to be." Grace smiled, reaching out to take his hand. They stood there for a moment, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the trees around them, the world quiet and peaceful. In that stillness, Grace felt the weight of the past months melt away, replaced by the joy of the present and the hope of the future. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Grace said, her voice thoughtful. "About how much has changed, about how far we've come." Daniel squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "We've come a long way," he agreed, "and I wouldn't change any of it." Grace smiled at his words, but there was a seriousness in her expression as she continued. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Daniel. You saved my life, more than once." Daniel shook his head gently, his thumb brushing across her hand. "You saved yourself, Grace. I just gave you the chance to fight." Grace's smile softened, and she felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done. For me, for my family." Daniel looked at her, his expression tender but firm. "You don't need to repay me. You and your family gave me everything when I had nothing. All of this, it's just the cycle coming back around." Grace's heart swelled at his words. It was true. What had started with her father's act of kindness all those years ago had come full circle. Daniel had repaid that kindness in ways they could never have imagined. And now, standing here with him, Grace felt the full weight of that connection. "It's amazing how one small act can change everything," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, his gaze drifting toward the fields. "It is. Your father gave me a second chance at life. And now, we've found something even more because of it." Grace leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. As they stood there, taking in the beauty of the moment, she thought about her father, about the man who had given everything to help someone in need, never expecting anything in return. And now, because of that simple act of kindness, their lives had been forever changed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the family gathered around the dinner table, the conversation was light and filled with laughter. James and Sarah sat at one end, their faces glowing with happiness as they watched their daughter, strong and healthy, smile and laugh alongside Daniel. The joy in the room was palpable, and for James, it was a moment of deep pride. His family had been through so much: hardship, illness, fear, and yet here they were together, stronger than ever. And Daniel. Well, James had come to think of Daniel as part of the family now. The young man who had once been a stranger had become someone they couldn't imagine their lives without. As the meal came to an end, James cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I want to say something," he began, his voice a little rough but filled with emotion. "We've all been through a lot these past few months, and I know I don't say it often, but I'm proud of all of us. Proud of this family." Sarah smiled at him, her eyes soft with affection, and Grace's hand found Daniel's under the table. James continued, his gaze settling on Daniel. "Daniel, you've been more than a friend to us. You've been family. And I want you to know that no matter what, you'll always have a place here. You've done more for us than I could ever repay, and we're forever grateful." Daniel, clearly moved by James's words, nodded, his voice quiet but steady as he replied, "Thank you, Mr. James. This place has been more of a home to me than anywhere I've ever been. I'm just glad I could be here for all of you." The room fell into a comfortable silence after that, the weight of James's words hanging in the air like a quiet blessing. Grace glanced over at Daniel, her heart full, and in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the night drew to a close, Grace found herself standing outside, looking up at the stars. Daniel joined her, his hand slipping into hers as they stood in the cool night air. "You know," Grace said softly, "I think we're going to be okay." Daniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the light of the stars above them. "Yeah, I think we are." And as they stood there, under the vast expanse of the night sky, Grace felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The cycle of kindness that had started so many years ago had come full circle. And now, with Daniel by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they had found something beautiful, something that would last.